A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Salzburg Global Seminar and 21st Century Trust. I'm John Lotherington. I'm Director of 21st Century Trust and a Programme Consultant at Salzburg, and the two organisations work on many projects very, very closely, and we're delighted that this Mortimer Dialogue is one of them. And first up, thank you so much to the Aga Khan Centre for being our hosts and to the wonderful colleagues we have worked with in preparing for this meeting. We're very grateful indeed. Now, this is the Mortimer Dialogue because of someone who many of you knew. Many of you here were friends and colleagues of Edward Mortimer. On a personal level, I would say he was the most astonishing friend and colleague and inspiration for around 30 years that I had the enormous privilege of knowing and working with Edward. He was a towering intellect, of course. He was a great writer, a committed humanitarian, and someone of total integrity. I should also stress he was enormous fun and someone of enormous modesty as well. He wasn't just a brilliant writer. He wasn't just a brilliant speaker. He was a brilliant listener. He loved this sort of thing because he always wanted to encounter new ideas or take old ideas and interrogate them afresh. And one of the ideas he was so committed to, one of the doctrines he was so committed to, was the responsibility to protect. It meant so much to him intellectually, morally, and in terms of a view of the way the world should be. And he, of course, wrote the speech in 2005, whereby Kofi Annan launched this doctrine. But the years have gone on since that time. This doctrine has been tested. And what we do know is that Edward passionately believed in that doctrine, but he would want to re-examine it. He would want to think about it afresh. He would want to make sure that in the way it was functioning, it was actually going to do some good in the world in the future. And I can't think of anybody he would have been happier knowing that was going to lead this discussion than Shashi Tharoor and Gideon Rachman. And a warm welcome to you both. Shashi was Under Secretary-General at the United Nations, had worked in that organisation for many years and was one of the key people involved in responsibility to protect, and a very close friend and colleague of Edward's. Now a very distinguished politician in India, an observer on international affairs, and a critic indeed on the way that Britain related to India in the background as well. Many articles, many books, and a distinguished thought leader. And his view is that we need to think about reinterpreting the responsibility to protect. And we're so looking forward to hearing some of his ideas this evening. But Edward wouldn't have wanted just a sort of speech. What he would have wanted was a good hard talk type of conversation. And it's wonderful that Gideon here, who is Edward's successor at the Financial Times and has maintained that extraordinary leadership in interrogating the way the world is working for that newspaper, which one might say distinguishes itself compared with many other newspapers and the views of the world that they put forward. And Gideon is going to be in conversation with Shashi, teasing out some of the key points here. Now, they're going to talk together for about half an hour. And then afterwards, we will have a floor discussion. And there are a number of people here who were themselves involved in framing the responsibility to protect. And we look forward to hearing supporters, critics, and people who want to advance this agenda. I shall be moderating that, and then we'll conclude with the chair of the 21st Century Trust and longtime board member of Salzburg Global Seminar, Peter Wilson-Smith. But before we move on, I would just like to say that this whole event was the inspiration of Tina Micklethwaite. Tina is a trustee of 21st Century Trust. She was a long-time colleague of Edward's at the United Nations, and then she came to Salzburg Global as well to do some work there, and is now on our board. She has been such a sort of a mover and a shaker in getting this organised, someone who has self a passionate belief in this issue, and someone who has also been, we're very grateful, a co-sponsor of this event. So Tina is just going to say a few words.
Thank you, John. It's just wonderful to see so many of Edward's friends here, his family, and some new friends as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Tina. And now over to Shashi and Gideon.
Thanks, John. Thanks to the Al Khan Foundation and to Tina for arranging this, and thanks to Shashi for giving his time. I know interviewing you will be a relatively easy job because once you're turned on, you're pretty unstoppable. So
I'm not sure that's meant to be a compliment, but thank you, Gideon.
It was meant as a compliment. So obviously we want to talk about the future in a bit, but let's start by going back to the origins of the idea. You were there at the UN, as was Edward at the time when this was formulated. If you relatively briefly, could you just give us an idea of where did this come from, the responsibilities?
Well, in fact, Edward had a lot to do with it. I actually knew Edward when he was in your job at the FT, and I talked to him informally about whether he might consider joining us at the United Nations, and particularly to take over a task that I was doing in addition to other jobs, that of being Kofi Annan's chief speechwriter, which he was far, far better at than I could ever have been. But in any case, he was willing to consider it. We both agreed it would be useful for him to attempt a speech even before he decided whether to accept the job or not. So in his own time, he wrote a speech on intervention, which I think, now this is where my memory might be faltering, I think Kofi delivered it in Ditchley. But in any case, it was, Wiz is nodding. And it was a spectacular success. The two of them thought alike on these matters, and Edward's thinking on intervention and Kofi's thinking on intervention were pretty much compatible. I think also Edward's felicity for language and the fact that his sentences were far easier to utter than mine had been sort of clinched the deal.
And it came out of a particular historical moment, though, did it?
Yes, it was just after, well, Rwanda had occurred when Kofi was Under Secretary-General for Peacekeeping. And it was something that really, really scarred many of us. In 1994, I was handling Bosnia at the time. Lord Hannay is here. He remembers that period well from his perch in the Security Council. But when Rwanda was happening, we actually had a very small team of peacekeepers on the ground for a totally different purpose, to oversee a broad-based transitional government on the basis of peace settlement between the Hutus and the Tutsis. It was headed by a Canadian general called Romeo Dallaire. And Dallaire started picking up, I mean, we don't have intelligence operations at the UN, but if you keep your eyes and ears open, it was not difficult to pick up that there were arms caches being stored all over the city, and there was likely to be preparations for a large-scale massacre. And so he sent an urgent cable to the United Nations saying, send me 5,000 troops, because I could probably save 500,000 lives with it. The cable was taken to the Security Council, but the US had felt terribly burned by an incident a few months previously in Mogadishu, Somalia, where they had sent peacekeepers, and they'd suddenly lost a whole bunch of them in what was meant to be a fairly routine operation, but where they fell afoul of an ambush, and the Somalian insurgents killed a few Americans, brought down a helicopter, and frankly did something pretty awful to the pilots, dragged them through the streets until they sort of were beaten to a pulp and all sorts of things. It was quite horrible. And the Americans were horrified at the idea of any more interventions, particularly in Africa. So they essentially prevented the Security Council from doing anything about this. Not only were Dallaire's requested 5,000 troops not sent, but in fact the small contingent we had there was withdrawn when the massacres began. And the whole episode really stained the international community. Edward wrote his speech about a year later, and it had such a profound impact that Kofi returned to the theme in an address to the General Assembly in 2000, again authored by Edward, which had the sentence, and that's what I was looking for. If humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, Kofi asked the General Assembly, how should we respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, which is, as you remember, the massacre in Bosnia, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity? And this was a concern that Kofi was emboldened to place before the international community, having reflected over the whole intervention issue with Edward and with all of us. And when that question was asked to the General Assembly, the mood in the world was very different from what we know today. It was the famous unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War. There was American leadership, the Russians still under Yeltsin, I think, or maybe Putin had just taken over, it was quite new. were very happy to work within the consensus. The Chinese were still biding their time and not taking any stands on issues that didn't affect them directly. It was a moment when a lot of things seemed possible. And don't forget the heady days of the end of history when it seemed that the triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism was all sort of going to, be the universal consensual global model and all of that. That was the atmosphere at the time.
Sorry, could I just ask, was it consciously a big change in the way the international system was meant to operate?
I'm sorry, yes, of course, I should have said that. Sovereignty was always associated with inviolability. That is that states, from the days of the Treaty of Westphalia, jealously safeguarded their rights to handle their own affairs and to stand up against anyone else's interference with their sovereignty. So there was sort of a trio of principles which, frankly, have come to haunt us again with the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year. State sovereignty, the inviolability of borders, and inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes. And these were sort of absolutely common ground for everybody, the West, the East, the developing countries, decolonized countries, former colonial powers, everyone subscribed to these principles. So intervening in Rwanda against the wishes of the extant Rwandan government would have been inferior violation of their sovereignty, except there wasn't an extant government. There was a broad-based transitional government that was about to be formed, which included both factions. And the United Nations was there already on the ground with the authorization of the Security Council. It would merely have been a question of expanding its mandate and its capacity to undertake what we had already begun to call preventive deployment. We had, for example, during the Yugoslav Civil War, sent 5,000 troops to Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, to prevent the war spilling over there. And they had succeeded in preventing the war spilling over there. So there was no particular argument really that was credible against doing this in Rwanda, other than the fact that a permanent member and the principal member of the Security Council was reluctant. But anyway, be that as it may, yes, it would have been a departure, and that's why Kofi posed it as a question. So I read the exact words out because he put this to the membership as a question they needed to address. It was a remarkably thoughtful speech, and I would urge you all to Google it. It'll also show you Edward's penmanship at its best. But in any case, the General Assembly in 2000 had to confront this question. And the Canadians, bless their souls, said, this is an important thing, we can't leave it unaddressed. So they financed something that was called the International Commission for Intervention and State Sovereignty. They put Gareth Evans, the then former Australian Foreign Minister, and Mohamed Sahnoun, the former Algerian Foreign Minister, as the co-chairs. And it was a very interesting committee. Michael Ignatieff was on it. There were a few others. And they were entrusted with figuring out the answer to Kofi's question. And this then resulted in a remarkable report which they called The Responsibility to Protect, which essentially changed the idea of sovereignty as inviolability to one of sovereignty as responsibility. And their argument was that there are three kinds of responsibility. A state has the responsibility of looking after the welfare of its own citizens. Other states have the responsibility to assist such states if they need assistance to look after their own citizens. And the international community has a responsibility to look after these people if the state is unwilling or unable to do so. So it was a very interesting concept. I should mention, you and I have talked about this before, Gideon, that there had been, since the 1980s, a rather controversial doctrine first articulated by the French humanitarian Bernard Kouchner called the droit d'ingérence, the right to interfere or the right to intervene. And that never quite caught on because though he was talking about it in the context of the humanitarian crises of the 80s, the Vietnamese boat people crisis and very many other African crises, it was seen by many developing countries as a rich, powerful Western voice claiming some sort of right to intervene in their affairs.
So the responsibility to protect was easier to command.
Exactly. It turned the whole thing around. It no longer became a right to intervene, it became a responsibility.
So we need to get on. So the responsibility, you have the report, then it comes back to the UN.
Yeah.
And at what point does it become settled?
So in 2003, there was a world summit at the head of state level, head of state, head of government level, at the United Nations, and they endorsed this concept. which actually I think would not have happened if it had happened, if the whole episode was 15 years earlier or 15 years later, it would not have been adopted. But at that time, in the atmosphere I described to you, it was adopted as a principle.
And has it changed the world, and how did it work out?
Well, I think the intention was both to create a new norm that governments would cite, that academics would cite, the theoreticians would cite, and so on, and also to create a new practice, to create, as we saw with Rwanda, governments are unwilling very often to commit troops. So you had to presume that with this norm, you would get governments willing to risk blood and treasure, as it were, sending their troops to look after civilians in faraway countries. Second, you had to presume that not only would they do that, they would actually be willing to give it legitimacy through the Security Council. See, that was very important too, because the Security Council's authorization is what gives an imprimatur of legitimacy to an action which otherwise could have been seen as an ingérence, an interference, a violation of sovereignty. So you would have, on the one hand, the Council would legitimize it, on the other, troops would be provided by member states. And the third principle, of course, is that there would be support in the domestic publics of these countries to actually do this to protect civilians in faraway lands where no national interests were directly involved. So you may remember Tony Blair made a speech soon after this. In fact, I think it was at the 2003 summit or very soon thereafter, where he said, now the West will intervene militarily only in defense of its values and not of its interests. Which, when you think about it, is a mind-boggling statement for the Prime Minister of a country to make. And needless to say, it didn't quite happen that way, did it, Gideon?
No. Okay, so have there been any worked examples of the responsibility to protect? Some would say that the closest we came to was Libya, 2011.
Well, let me start off by saying that when the Iraq intervention happened, when America and Britain, having failed to get a Security Council authorization, marched in any way into Iraq, their initial statements, and you can Google this if you wish, couched their intervention in terms of humanitarianism. Saddam Hussein was oppressing his own people, had also attacked Kuwait, had attacked Iran, etc., and it was necessary to protect the people of the region that they had to get. It didn't wash. At that time,
and it was coupled with WMD, which is the one that people remember.
Well, of course. But I mean, yes, exactly. So Iraq, the idea never quite stuck, and I think that phrase wasn't used. But you're right. When Libya came up some years later, 2011, that became the actual basis for the Security Council to discuss the issue. And on that occasion, the argument was Gaddafi is an awful man. He's busy bombing Benghazi, massacring his own civilians. We need to stop him. What was not spelled out, but was fairly understood by, at least if you talk to the diplomats on the council at that time, I had left the UN by then, the argument was that you need to level the playing field because you can't let this one man massacre everyone else. And so the council authorized all necessary means to prevent this from happening. Now, when the famous report was written in 2001, it wasn't only about responsibility to protect using force. It was very much spelled out in the report that you could have a gradation of measures, start off with sanctions or embargoes and move towards possible preventive deployment. If prevention doesn't work, then to send troops. But also to then promote peace and reconciliation, to create conditions that would bring the conflict to an end. I mean, that was the kind of language that was written. Whereas what happened in Libya, as we know, was that after the bombing of Benghazi, the bombing became wider. There was an attack on Gaddafi's own civilian camp, which killed an infant child of his and a few other civilians. And it became very clear that the objectives of the Libyan intervention had changed from protecting Libyan civilians to overthrowing the regime. Now, you must remember that China had abstained in that resolution. India was a member of the council at the time, had abstained.
Russia voted for, yes? Or did
Russia was there, but I think they may have voted for. I don't remember now. I don't want to give you a misleading thing. They may still, at that point, Russia was still...
They didn't prevent it anyway.
No one prevented it.
Putin's subsequent chagrin.
Yeah, I mean, no one prevented it. The Russians may have abstained as well, but remember, this was the time when Putin was still talking about Russia joining NATO. Yeah. So, we were still some years away from the Crimean invasion and so on. And what happened was that the powers that were bombing Libya could point to the sanctity of a UN Security Council resolution. And that really created quite a backlash in many countries.
So you feel that France, Britain, the United States exceeded their mandate and therefore discredited the concept?
Well, Britain and the US was Iraq. Libya was all the NATO countries. It was a NATO bombing. It wasn't just two nations. And they can claim, and there is some justification for saying this, that UN Security Council resolutions are historically subject to interpretation when you implement them, and that therefore their understanding of all necessary measures might have included measures necessary to change an awful regime. But there was a definite backlash, certainly in Russia and China. The Russians did feel they'd been sold a bill of goods. The Chinese felt the same way. And many developing countries, I've spoken to Indian diplomats in the Council at that time, and they said the West never let on that their intention was to go through with regime change.
But thinking about it realistically, could you really, I mean, given what we know of Gaddafi, really say that you would protect Libyan civilians long into the future without removing Gaddafi? I mean, the guy was a monster.
So that was the argument of the West. But that raises very troubling questions in developing country capitals, saying, does that mean that every interpretation of responsibility to protect could imply a permission to overthrow a regime? Because that's not something that they were prepared to agree to. And if you look at the world in that last decade, the decade of the tens, I suppose, there were quite an awful lot of, well, even the few years before that, Sri Lanka. No one invoked responsibility to protect, no one sought to intervene. Look at the Yemen war more recently. Has anyone?
Syria, yeah.
And well, Syria, there was an attempt made to invoke responsibility to protect, and of course, the Russians would have none of it. It never got to the stage where they needed to veto, as far as I remember, but it was very clear they would not agree, and the Chinese too. And the Russians then, of course, arrayed themselves on the side of Assad, who was the one being accused of killing his civilians and of leading a murderous regime. But the fact is that in those circumstances, the Security Council was not able to do anything about Syria.
So 20 years on, have we learned that it's a very nice idea, but it doesn't actually work?
No, it can be made to work, it seems to me, but you have to understand very clearly those advocating it and those implementing it, what the ground rules are, what are the criteria that you can rely upon to actually intervene, what are the things you're allowed to resort to. I mean, a loose phrase like all necessary measures, which I wouldn't even be surprised if David had thought of in his days in the Security Council as Britain's permanent representative, because it was a very convenient phrase that didn't actually seem to threaten the use of force, but at the same time implicitly authorized it. I will say that if you look very, very solidly at this, you're not going to get many countries on the Council agreeing to legitimizing a responsibility to protect-based operation unless all of these things are spelled out. Until you say what are the criteria on the basis of which this will be exercised and how would you go ahead and implement it. Having said that, the world has also changed, Gideon. Today, I remember the era when I was dealing with Yugoslavia when the public clamor about, for God's sake, do something was rampant. Today in America, the public clamor is, for God's sake, do nothing. Do not intervene. Do not send our troops abroad. Do not take risks. So it's a different world. And that sort of heady period I talked about when people expected that the world would sort of find consensus on it, and that's not the world we're living in today.
Yeah, so the American domestic consensus has changed, but also I'm sure the world's view of American intervention has changed. The idea that the Russians or the Chinese would ever sign off on that ever again seems to me implausible. But
don't forget Hammarskjöld had found a solution to that particular problem way back in the mid-50s, which is to get the smaller and middle powers to intervene. That was what peacekeeping, which he really created out of whole cloth, it's not mentioned in the Charter, was a way of responding to the Cold War standoff between Russia and America. And now you have a new Cold War incipient, not quite the same as the old one, but still, there where Russia and China on the one hand and the West on the other will never agree on anything. They could agree on sending the Irish and the Canadians and the Indians and the Fijians or whatever to go off and intervene somewhere. That's not impossible, provided the ground rules are very clear and they're told how far they can go and what they cannot do.
And it's interesting, isn't it, when you look at the language that Putin used to justify invading Ukraine, it was a slightly warped form of responsibility to protect. I mean, he was claiming to protect people in eastern Ukraine.
That's right, and he talked about the neo-Nazi groups that had made common cause with the Ukrainian army and all sorts of things. So, I mean, that was the justification. I don't think it washed with anybody.
No.
Because don't forget that the critics of responsibility to protect are at the same time staunch defenders of sovereignty. In fact, that's the basis for their criticism. So how on earth are they going to accept what Russia has done when Russia has blatantly violated sovereignty?
Yeah. I mean, you talked about how a lot of people in, forgive the phrase, in the global south were suspicious of Kushner's idea of the right of intervention, and that responsibility to protect seemed more acceptable. Is the responsibility to protect still an idea that might command an audience in India or in South Africa or wherever, or do you think it's been discredited?
I think to some degree its application has been seen as questionable, but I cannot for the life of me accept the proposition that the idea should be discarded, because it responded to a genuine human concern about egregious violations. I mean, killing 1 million people, as happened in Rwanda, is about as egregious as it gets. And do we want to stand by and watch that happen again? I think it will work, going back to some of the original thinking, the Blairite language, that when values are involved and not interest directly. You know, when intervention seems to be about oil or seems to be about the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East or whatever, then there will be resistance and there will be concern about it. But when you have a situation like a Rwanda, many others, and in places in the world in which clearly other countries don't have a stake and they're acting in a disinterested way, that could conceivably work. But the problem is going to be you'll need political will in your domestic setup. You'll need the legitimacy of a Security Council resolution. Certainly, for example, a country like India or Ireland would not send troops without that. And you would also need the resources that it takes to do these things. And right now, the willingness to supply any of these three is actually not particularly high.
And you also said we need agreed upon criteria. And would that criteria have to say, well, this is only going to come into play in a very extreme situation, a Rwanda, where people are about to be massacred? Because the word genocide is now used much more loosely. You know, people say the Uyghurs are suffering a genocide. People have said that, you know, the Ukrainians claim there's a genocide against Ukrainians. So should we say only when there's lives immediately at risk?
That's right. I think that's one thing. To begin with, there's also a gradation of the responses. So you can have, for example, it could say that the first responsibility would be to try and bring about a change in the circumstances through punitive sanctions, embargoes, and the like. Diplomatic isolation. There are various things you can do to increase the pain level for a country that's about to commit a violation. There's also, of course, the classic peacemaking role of the Secretary-General, which I do feel could have been exercised in Ukraine. I mean, the British and the Americans were shouting from every rooftop for 7 weeks that the Russians are about to invade. And it dismays me that the Secretary-General of the UN didn't hop on a plane and go to Moscow to find out what their intentions were and whether a solution could have been found. Because when you think about it, that's what Kofi did in '98 when Clinton first threatened the bombing of Baghdad. I was with him. We traveled to Iraq. And he was able, in the end, he was not able to buy more than 6 or 7 months of peace because the next violation by the Iraqis did bring about the bombing. But at least the obligation to try. And, of course, to lay out the conditions under which. So the Americans said, okay, we'll hold off on the bombing if you can get Saddam to cooperate with the IAEA inspectors and Ambassador Butler's intrusive inspections and so on. The Iraqis did agree. So you could use all of these techniques first, but if all else fails, you must be prepared to authorize force. Yeah. And then can you get the force there quickly enough in time and so on? That remains.
Sure. Last question from me before I go to the audience. But, I mean, you said that it was a product of a particular historical moment which you described. Was it also the product of an unusually effective UN Secretary-General, or one who had a certain charisma?
I believe so. I mean, he certainly liked to think outside the box, push the envelope, all these cliches. In fact, when he decided to make a speech on intervention, the very first one that Edward wrote, we had some real questions about whether this was a wise thing for a brand new Secretary-General to attempt to do. But he was clear in his mind that if at all there was anything to be said for the notion of the moral authority of the office, you know, the secular Pope, I think the Economist dubbed him the secular Pope at that time, then it meant raising some of the uncomfortable questions. And I, you know, we talked about Edward's draft at the time. He was quite clear in his mind that this was worth saying and that he would say it. And I was in the audience, and there was a sort of frisson through the hall as he spoke. There was this real sense of something, a sort of new door had been opened, or at least a window that was letting an awful lot of light and fresh air that we would somehow have to come to terms with.
Okay, so just a really last question from me. Is that going to be remembered, though, as a moment of sort of high idealism, like, you know, the moment where people signed a treaty outlawing war and it was a great idea, but actually nothing really came of it in the end? Or do you think the responsibility to protect is an idea that has a future as well as a past?
I believe it does. I think our history, the world's history, is full of ideas that didn't actually succeed the moment they were first articulated. Female suffrage, for example. It took years, maybe decades, for it to become reality. But the norm, it became the norm by people saying this is a good thing in principle and worth doing in practice. The Nansen passport for refugees, Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian explorer, had come up with. That wasn't immediately accepted by governments. And what is this? You know, the only passport we recognize is one that a sovereign government issues. But in the end, it's now common, and the UN issues the Nansen passport. We've got other examples, the Libya Code for War that the American military to this day follows. So I would say that if the idea is out there and it's allowed not to die, circumstances may change again. Just as the world of today is not the world of 20 years ago, nor will the world of 20 years from now necessarily be the world we know today.
Okay, thanks.
And it might be possible.
Right. Questions? There's lots of people in the audience. John, are you going to be Master of Ceremonies?
Thank you very much indeed.
I would love to hear Gideon's views on some of this.
No.
Sorry.
You don't want to hear my views.
Oh, come on.
I think we may have a chance to hear Gideon's views, and I hope he will indeed join in some of the responses. So thank you very much, both Shashi and Gideon. That really was fascinating.